Okay, so here is Andrea. I don't know if these things are kind of, I can close the, so I'll leave the Zoom up, or the chat up.
Great.
And then,
so they see what we're seeing here.
Yep, they're seeing what we see, and you can tab through using these guys, or if you kind of hover over these arrows.
Oh, down there. Okay.
Yep.
Got it. Great.
And I'll just hang out here, but give you some space, so I'm not sort of hovering around.
All right. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate the handoff here, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the seminar. We're excited to have you here with our second session of the 6-part series. I want to welcome all of our folks here in Montana, our national service members, volunteers, community partners, as well as those folks joining us from other states across the country. We always welcome lots of different types of participation, and while we may be in different geographic regions, community building, community engagement, national service work can look very similar in regardless of region of the country, especially when it comes to building aspects of programming and communication and identifying ways to meet community needs. So welcome. Like Josh said, our topic for today is looking at how we can work to create more broad community awareness, specifically through stakeholder involvement. So hopefully that's what you're expecting for today. And I hope you all had a chance to take a look at the TED Talk that was also connected to this today's seminar. The TED Talk about how hacking can be a civic engagement activity. So we'll talk a little bit more, incorporate some of that information from the TED Talk a little bit later in my talk today. All right, so let's see if I can get this forwarding through the different slides. Perfect. All right, so basically our agenda for the day is to take a look at who our stakeholders are, why they're important to us, what are some of their roles and functions, so we can just kind of have a common understanding of stakeholders, and then focus in more specifically on some communication strategies to do outreach to our stakeholders, help educate them about what we're doing, provide different opportunities for engagement, and hopefully then be able to turn our stakeholder partners into advocates for the work that we do together. So that's where we're heading for today. We will start then with looking specifically at defining who stakeholders are and what they do for us. The very sort of academic definition of stakeholder is a stakeholder can be defined as any group, person, or organization that can place a claim on an organization's attention, the resources of that organization, or their output, or that may be affected by the output of the organization itself. So essentially, there are people who play a role in helping organizations to achieve their goals, achieve their missions, and their objectives. And stakeholders definitely have different types of needs and expectations of the organization that they're partnered with. And stakeholders can be either internal to your organization, so people who work or volunteer with you, or they might be external to the organization itself. And I think sometimes that can be, that might not be something that we pay close attention to when we're talking about stakeholders is, are they internal to us or external? So looking at this list, certainly employees would be examples of internal stakeholders, whereas the clients and customers might be external, those people that we serve. Donors and funders obviously have an important stake in the organization. Boards of directors who help to govern nonprofit organizations play an important role. Other nonprofit organizations and partner organizations would be other important stakeholders, and then also including things like banks that might hold mortgages on property owned by nonprofits or leased by nonprofits, or perhaps hold lines of credit available to nonprofit organizations. Those would certainly be important stakeholders too. And then different suppliers that might provide things like food or equipment or materials for your programs. So hopefully looking at this list can help you identify or recognize that stakeholders can be a pretty broad range of people connected to your organization. And I think it's important then to be able to have this broad perspective, because it helps the organization itself and the programs and services that you all are involved in potentially fundraising for or delivering. It helps keep it grounded within the organization. And I think that's really necessary for organizations to continuously be aware of who their stakeholders are, how they're managing those stakeholder relations, because it really impacts the ability of an organization to meet its public purpose, its public service mission, and really be held accountable for that social contract that exists between communities and the nonprofit organizations or government entities that are there to serve community needs. So I'll pause here for a second. This is our first chat question. So if you want to take a minute after I pose the question, then you can take some time to type in your feedback, your responses there within the chat box on the screen. So first chat question, I guess it's a set of questions. Who are the stakeholders so far that you've interacted with within your organization and during your term of service? And I recognize some of you are fairly new to your terms of service, and many of you have been serving for several months within your organization. So far, who are, give us some examples of stakeholders that you are involved with. And then can you think of stakeholders that I haven't mentioned or that maybe are not listed on this list that you've been in contact with so far? So let's take a couple minutes to give some folks time to put those responses in as chats. All right, starting to see some come through now. So some examples of stakeholders so far are students, veterans, staff of the organization, government agencies, clients, employees, boards of directors, foundations, nonprofit commerce members, education institutes, project partners, funders, donors. Great. Alumni, well, that's another important list of stakeholders or grouping of stakeholders that I didn't mention, especially if you're affiliated with things like an educational institution or some other organization that has programming that clients or customers or beneficiaries potentially graduate from or move on from. So alumni is a great new addition. Vendors, great. Vendors might fall under that supplier category or could be different perhaps as well. So, all right, so those are some great examples. Any last ones we want to include there that haven't been mentioned so far? Keep an eye on it. All right. So then looking at, now that we kind of know, have a broad sense of who our potential and real stakeholders are, let's talk for a minute about how important these folks are. And the fact that, it's really important to be aware of your stakeholders so that you can understand the ways in which you need to engage and support and continue to collaborate with them. Another aspect of that type of work in supporting and engaging your stakeholders is being able to understand the networks and the politics that surround the organization that you're serving and working in. Because an understanding of those networks of politics and the web of relationships that organizations have within communities, I think are really important for actual partnership development or potential partnership development. So being aware of both of those aspects of how stakeholders are interfacing with the organization can be very helpful. I think it's also helpful to define who your stakeholders are and have a good understanding of them, because having that awareness provides a better context for you as you're continuing or thinking about ways and generating ways to effectively communicate with your stakeholders, engage them in programming potentially, or fundraising activities or shared and collaborative programming. So stakeholders can hold influence over organizations or programs, and that can have sometimes positive and negative influence as well. So once you've identified who your stakeholders are and kind of looking at that sphere of influence that they have within your organization, then you can understand better kind of what you're asking them to do through your partnership, whether it's asking for their money, their time, their political influence, or their connection to other entities that you need to be partnered with. So then once you know that about your stakeholders, what kind of things they bring to the table in helping you to accomplish your goals, you can really help to prioritize who you reach out to as you want to potentially engage new stakeholders or manage current stakeholder partnerships in different ways as needs of your organizations change. So kind of this ongoing analysis is pretty important of understanding where they come, is it political influence? Is it financial influence? Is it the ability to network and connect you to other types of stakeholders and partner organizations? And the final one there that I didn't really touch on is whether or not the stakeholder, their role with you is to help you effectively offer your programs and services. Is there some key function that they play in helping you to be successful in serving the needs of your community? So how do they impact the effectiveness of your organization? So looking at these forms of influence that stakeholders have can be a way of helping to manage them. So next chat question is, have you seen the influence of stakeholders at your organization already? What does that influence look like? Is it potentially positive or negative? So thinking about who you've engaged with as stakeholders so far within your organizations, then kind of looking at this list of options, what kind of influence have they had with your organization, and has it been positive or negative? You don't have to go into detail about that, but just helping to give our group an understanding of what these influences and impacts have been so far would be really helpful, I think, at this stage. So give a few moments here to let you think about that and build up some examples. All right. Yes, so engaging stakeholders has been positive so far. It looks like with opening doors into other areas of support. Okay. Okay, opening doors, some positive, some negative, particularly on the political end of things. And, that word political means a lot these days. And, that can mean helping build relationships, helping to identify allies in the type of work that you're doing. So definitely an important thing to keep in mind. Let's see, stakeholders' concerns guide what the director requires from me and the employees. So having that conduit of input sounds like from stakeholders helps to influence the kind of work that's done by employees in the organization. Yeah, especially if those concerns are coming from the clients you're serving or potentially your board or your donors. Yeah, that can really provide heavy influence on the work of the organization. All right, any other examples that want to come through there? Okay. All right, we will move on to the next slide. Sorry, a little clunky here. All right, so as we identified who our stakeholders are, looking at their influence, it can kind of then provide a nice segue into how these stakeholders can help to support the organization through specific roles and functions. So like I said earlier, providing donations, funding, stakeholders can be funding agencies like foundations or government programs. Definitely providing input on direction of programming services like we see in the chat box there, where stakeholders' concerns really guide what kind of work the director and the staff of the organization and volunteers are doing. Another big role is helping to understand the scope of the problem within the community. This can be, really important in terms of building ties, which connects to the next bullet point on there, but really helping you to understand the scope of the problem in the community, I think is a fundamental value of having a broad spectrum of stakeholders, because your organization might be involved in providing crisis housing, for example, and you might be working with stakeholder groups that provide maybe more long-term permanent housing assistance. So knowing what your partners in this sphere of work are doing within a community around an issue like homelessness and housing certainly helps you build those connections, helps you understand the scope of the problem within your community and the specific roles of your organization. And that's also an example of how organizations and stakeholders, benefit from working together to do this work. It can be much more strategic. You can, help to cut down on duplication of services that's unnecessary and costly, those types of things. The other comment I wanted to make as well regarding building ties with other entities doing similar work, this really is the concept that underlies the idea of collective impact work. I'm not sure how many of you might be involved in collective impact initiatives or programming within your communities. I've been involved here in Missoula in the past as a collective impact initiative was getting kind of launched. And a big part of the beginning, the initial stages of that launch was really working with stakeholders from different economic sectors like nonprofit organizations, government organizations, and private businesses or business organizations within our community to make sure that we had input from all of those different types of stakeholders around a specific issue in our community. In this case, it was early childhood programs and services. So that collective model approach really underscores a lot of these roles and functions of stakeholder involvement. All right, chat question, next one here. Let's see. What are some examples of important stakeholders so far that you've engaged with your organization? Who are the stakeholders your organization could not survive without and why? And maybe just a brief description of that critical role. So let's hear some examples of who important stakeholders have been so far with you, why you couldn't survive without them, and what their critical role has been. All right, starting to get some new input. Okay, local health department. They provide most of their funding, so definitely would be hard to survive without one of your major funders. That's a very important role. Project partners that generate revenue and work, okay? So would maybe expand a little bit on the work. Is it the service, the work and programming of the organization? Let's see, another example is Communities in Action. It's a coalition of partners that you're working with there in Richland County. That's great. A couple of other examples. Provides, okay. Yeah, so they provide the vehicle for programming, Montana Conservation Corps. Okay, so that's an example of project partner work. Example of other stakeholders, so great networking. If they can't help with certain projects, they can connect me with someone who can. Exactly, building ties with other entities doing similar work. Okay, great. Those are all excellent examples. Anything else? Okay. The other thing to note here as we're sort of wrapping up this piece on stakeholders is to recognize that the role of stakeholders can change in the life cycle of your organization, or if you're talking about a specific program, kind of carving out a grouping of stakeholders related to a specific program. So in the beginning, a stakeholder might start out potentially as a donor or a volunteer, and they may help to provide funding or, sort of boots on the ground power to get something launched. And then as that program gets up and running, they might transition into other roles as a stakeholder. They might be interested in serving on the board. They might transition into, volunteers often are applying for staffing positions, that type of thing. So it's another reason to maintain, kind of an ongoing reflective way of monitoring and understanding who your important stakeholder groups are. So you can maintain consistent connection and really be able to manage those stakeholder relations well. And that does require some, some attention. It's, something that we may not be paying attention to on an ongoing basis with our work. But this tool might help, from a practical standpoint, be an example of a way to help you be able to monitor and track stakeholder engagement. So this is a basic matrix of stakeholder power and interest. And so along that y-axis there, we have the power. Along the x-axis down here at the bottom, it's their level of interest. So we've got these 4 quadrants in the middle. And so basically the quadrants are based on stakeholders' levels of power and how much influence the stakeholders yield over the organization. So if you go back and think about some of the stakeholders that you've identified and who they are, you could kind of put them into these quadrants or categories. So who are the types of stakeholders that you want to keep satisfied? They have a high level of power within your organization, but perhaps have a lower level of interest. So some examples there might be donors or clients, customers, beneficiaries of services. It may be employees that aren't fully vested or fully bought into the mission or programming of the organization. So you want to make sure you're keeping those people satisfied, because they do yield some high power. They can have negative influence if they, aren't kept satisfied. If we go down to this lower left quadrant, the monitor. So this is the quadrant that probably requires the least amount of effort on the part of the organization to kind of maintain and continue contact with. So these might be examples of stakeholders like your suppliers, or if you have a partnership with a bank, in terms of lending and lines of credit. So you definitely need to monitor those relationships, but it's probably not relationships that you're dealing with on a daily basis or that require a lot of time and attention from leadership within the organization or staff members. So that's another category. Let's move over to the bottom right of keep informed. So these might be stakeholders like your volunteers. You definitely want to keep your volunteers informed of activities and be reaching out to them for opportunities for them to engage and volunteer. So it's this quadrant in the upper right that really probably requires the most energy on the part of the organization to maintain and manage stakeholders within that encourage and influence matrix, quadrant of the matrix. So this might be donors, it might be parents of youth who are potentially the beneficiaries of your service. It could be volunteers. If you're an all volunteer run organization, you really need to encourage and influence and maintain high levels of contact with that stakeholder group. So I think if you can go back to your list of stakeholders that you have in mind of who you've been working with and how they influence the organization, and then kind of plot them on this matrix. And it's kind of an interesting exercise to potentially do with at a staff meeting or something like that, is to find out, first of all, are you placing your stakeholders in the right quadrants? Like, do you all have agreement on who belongs where in this in the quadrant? And should certain stakeholders move from one quadrant to another? Do you want to be able to move volunteers or donors from the monitoring or keeping satisfied to a higher level of engagement within the organization? So it can help you build strategies around how to move stakeholders to different areas of this quadrant as you need them to be, depending on the level of engagement that you want or need from them. It will also help you understand if you have too many stakeholders in a specific area. If all of your stakeholders are in this encourage and influence box, you're spending a lot of capital, of human capital, financial capital of the organization maintaining those. So how can you strategically move some to balance out the level of stakeholders that you have across the spectrum of where they fall in terms of being supported and managed? So it's kind of a helpful stakeholder management tool is really what it kind of boils down to. So the next phase of this is, I'll move to this other slide here real quick. Understanding where they are on that matrix will then help you as you think about moving stakeholders from certain levels of action. Maybe they're at a minimal level of interaction and support for the organization, and you need them to be at a higher level of support or engagement with your organization. This is just a chart that helps you understand, are there strategies to help you get the attention of these stakeholders in different ways? Or do you need to reach out to a new segment of stakeholders to grab their attention, then build their interest through education and outreach efforts that we'll get to in just a few minutes? Building that interest would then increase their desire to get involved, to engage with the organization, to take action in a collaborative way to support the programs and services that you're charged with deploying in your communities. So just another, I hope, helpful chart to help you kind of think about strategies around managing, supporting, and engaging with your stakeholder groups. Okay. All right. There's a question, it looks like, in the chat box. Can you instruct people to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down box so everyone can see their response? Oh, okay. So yeah, down at the very bottom of the chat box, you should be able to have a little, there's a little drop-down menu. And if you click that little blue arrow, you want to be able to see all panelists and attendees. So that will help, hopefully, the whole group be able to see those responses. Sorry, I just now saw that. So in the future chat responses, let's make sure that you've clicked the option for all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see that chat. And I think you do need to open up the chat box sometimes manually if you kind of hover your cursor down at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Sometimes it's either at the very bottom on some screens, at the very top on other screens, then you can potentially open up that chat box too. Okay, thanks for the question. All right. So let's think about then, how do we align various stakeholders around a common vision to achieve the outcomes and the change or the impact that we want to see in the community through the organizations that we're connected to? So to do this, you really need to kind of think about how you're going to educate your stakeholders, engage them so that they can then be equipped with the knowledge and the passion that they need to ultimately become advocates for the work that you're doing. And the way I talk about advocates is really looking at people who will be your champion. They will be out there in a knowledgeable way, able to talk to other people about your organization, be able to potentially fundraise for your organization, be able to create a broader network of systems and connections to people and other organizations for you. So that's really a role of advocacy I see in this context, at least. Advocacy can also certainly mean, getting involved at, political levels of impacting and building legislation and things like that. For this role, I'm thinking of it in a little bit different context of, having these people become champions for your program within your communities, to broaden that network of support, to broaden the impact of the organization and help you be more effective in your programs and services. So there's a lot of different types of ways that you can engage, I think, through outreach efforts. So once you've identified who your current and potential stakeholders are, then you can concentrate your efforts where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, because we realize we're all very strapped for time and energy and resources to do this kind of work. So you need to be strategic about it. The level of effort needed to educate and engage your stakeholders can vary, again, from one to another, depending on where they might fall on that matrix that we talked about. And we really very seldom have the luxury to really extend the time and resources and energy needed to reach all of them. So in order to help you focus your primary targets, you want to really look at those people with whom you have maybe the greatest level of access to. Who are those potential stakeholders that they know a friend of a friend or a colleague of a colleague? How do you have potential access to these people? And then looking at also those with the influence and resources to move your organizations forward in the direction that you want to go. So number one, in terms of prioritizing stakeholder groups and targeting new stakeholder audiences, looking at those people with whom you have greatest levels of access and those with whom would have the influence and resources to help you move your programming and your organization in the direction it wants to go. So regardless of the strategy that you decide to use to educate and engage your stakeholders, it should be directly tied to that particular stakeholder and what their needs are and their function within your program. So again, going back to identifying who stakeholder audiences might be, narrowing in on what type of, what specific function they would play, what you're asking them to do would be really important. And then being able to place them within that matrix to make sure that you're not overloading your organization or yourself in any one of those areas that might require, everybody up in that top right quadrant would be, again, like I said, a little bit too taxing potentially on the organization. So figuring out where they're placed on that matrix and then the kinds of resources and support you need to do to engage them. And that really involves doing some research about potential stakeholders and the organizations that you want to bring on so that you can be really aware of what they can bring to your organization and how you need to create strategies to engage with them. So there is some method to the madness if you're able to think it through and work together, sometimes in teams, to figure these kinds of things out. So let's see if I can get this. There we go. One more. I lost my little slide projector thing there. Okay. So let's talk about reaching out and educating with stakeholders. There's lots of ways to do this, obviously, and this is just a smattering of examples. And I'll want to hear from you here in just a second about ways that you've already reached out and tried to engage with stakeholders. So first of all, let's talk about the written forms. You know, many organizations still do written newsletters. They do a hard copy newsletter, and that can be a great way to get out information. This might be in the form of annual reports, evaluations, performance indicator reports. These are great tools to help you educate stakeholders about what you do, how you do it, and how effective you are. More and more, we are looking at ways that we demonstrate impact. Our funders want to know, our stakeholder groups, our constituent audiences want to know how we're making impact. And a lot of that can be, you know, demonstrated or written up in these different types of resource materials through websites and annual reports and such. On the participatory side, there's lots of ways to, you know, interact and engage in a more active way with potential stakeholder groups. So some organizations will provide open forums where they invite the public in to learn more about programming and ways that the community can be more involved. I used to work with an after-school nonprofit organization here. I was on the board, and one thing they did was every month, you know, once a month, they would invite the public into one of their sites, one of their service sites, and give people a tour of the site and talk about the different types of programming they did with youth. And then they were able to talk, you know, provide examples of some of the activities, art, different products that kids were involved in. So it was a great way for people to get to see firsthand what this organization does. And then they were able to identify ways that they could become involved with the organization. So that's a really great participatory action kind of engagement activity. Obviously, we can't do much now in the world, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you're at with social media. But most of our organizations have a social media presence. And so being able to pay close attention to those networks and managing them well. I think you'll have one of our CBI sessions a little later, we'll talk about social media and marketing. And so you'll get much more insight from that person rather than me. But it can be a very participatory way of engaging with your stakeholder groups. And then of course there's traditional media too. Don't overlook that, because depending on who your audience is, many of them may be turning first to traditional media sources like their local TV stations or newspapers or other community information outlets. So it's important to recognize those as a form of educating and reaching out to stakeholders. But thinking, about how you're using Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, how are you getting that information out? And that's where we'll talk a little bit about the TED Talk in just a minute. Conducting individual meetings. This can be very time consuming, but it can also be time well invested in helping to build very solid, from the get-go, a very solid communication line with a group or an individual that you might be interested in bringing on as a stakeholder. And it's a good way to be able to connect over similar goals, shared visions that you might have with that person or their organization, and be able to talk through what some of those opportunities might look like. Again, this takes a lot of time, but that time is often well invested because it sets a framework, it sets a strong foundation for levels of trust with stakeholders, and it can help you potentially see the stakeholder partnership in new ways. You know, if you're presenting an opportunity to another organization and you're trying to reach out and partner with them on something, sitting down and talking with them and learning more about what they do and their strategies and visions can really sometimes open your eyes to new ways of doing things too. So it's time well invested, but you need to plan for that. Attending public meetings, there's depending on the size of the community that you live in and that your organization is doing its work in, There may be small or large types of public meetings that would be helpful to attend. I like to also always encourage people to reach out and see if there are community events or programs and program trainings that happen. These would be potentially in the realm of nonprofit networks that are located in individual communities. Here in Montana, we have the Montana Nonprofit Association that is kind of working with nonprofits at the state level, but there are many community-based networks of nonprofits that have meetings on a regular basis. Sometimes they're training type of meetings. Sometimes they're information sharing meetings where you can get to know what other nonprofits are doing in your community. And these are really excellent arenas for networking and building relationships with other partners who are doing this. So if you're in Montana or in another state, I would suggest that you go to the state association website. Here it's Montana Nonprofit Association. In other states, you could Google and find out if there's a statewide association. But here in Montana, I know we have a segment on the Montana Nonprofit Association website that lists the networks that exist in different locales throughout the state, and I believe the contact person for them too. So that's a great way to take a look at engaging and doing some networking within the nonprofit field within your community. So I've been talking a lot. Let's move to a chat question here. I'm interested in hearing what education strategies you or your organization has tried so far that were effective at reaching out to potentially new stakeholders or looking at ways to educate in new ways existing stakeholders. So let's talk about some education strategies you've tried. And if you haven't tried any, maybe you can offer up some ideas about strategies that you would like to try that you think might be a good fit for your organization and the kinds of work that you do. All right. Take a couple minutes to let people think about those strategies, what you've tried so far. What do you think works well? And if you think of yourself as a stakeholder in the groups that you're involved in, what ways have worked well for you to feel educated about something that's going on in your community? Okay, so in Richland County, it looks like they're using social media. They've used individual meetings, community conferences, yep, and newspapers, great. Let's see, annual reports, social media, newsletters, assessments, okay. Maybe give a couple more words about assessments. Is that assessments of program impacts, community needs? There's some great examples, thank you. Community needs assessment and information. Great. All right. Well, it sounds to me like you're all involved in some of these good examples already. As a stakeholder myself, I find being invited to the table is the best way to be educated on what's going on. Yeah. But, those individual meetings or being able to have time one-on-one with folks. Like I said, it takes a lot of time, but it can build a lot of social capital later on that will be very beneficial. So that's great. All right, let's move to the next slide. I'm looking at time here. I'm going to speed things up a little bit. I feel like I've been talking a little too much, so I got to get through the material here. So some ways to engage stakeholders. We've covered some of this already. First of all, obviously inviting their participation, being able to be clear about what you're asking them to do once they demonstrate interest in becoming a partner or a stakeholder with your organization. Establishing advisory boards. That's a really great way to invite people into your organization. And that will actually be your next CBI talk on Tuesday with Shannon, who's amazing. So you're going to learn a lot about the role and function of advisory boards. So I'm not going to say much about that. Offer to help them. How can you come to the table as a reciprocal mutual partner in this work within your community? What can you bring to the table in this partnership endeavor? What do they need from you? And then being confident about the likelihood of success. People tend to want to join things that they see have potential or in some cases, proven success that you want to build upon. So, being confident about the kinds of goals you're looking to achieve, confident about the different ways in which your partnership together will help you achieve those goals can be really powerful in creating energy and willingness to partner and move forward in that effort together. So those are some different, I guess, strategies around that. I want to take a few minutes now to, oops, hit the wrong button, sorry. To talk specifically about the TED Talk, because in that talk, they were able to, the speaker, Catherine Bracey is her name. The talk was titled, Why Good Hackers Make Good Citizens. I'll provide a brief summary for some of you that may not have had the chance to watch that talk. I think it's about a 9-minute talk. So if you haven't yet, I would encourage you to do so, because it really helped me see this work from a different frame of mind. But in summary, she's talking about, the title is Why Good Hackers Make Good Citizens. And so she is mentioning, or says, the definition of a hacker is any amateur innovation on an existing system. So that's interesting to think about in the context of community building, community engagement work, because it's an amateur innovation to an existing system. So if we think about how we're trying to innovate, we're trying to improve and seek greater impact, that's definitely, we're always constantly tweaking and innovating on existing systems for many instances in our work. So she's talking about it in the context of technology, of course, from the kind of work that she's doing, but I think it can be used in the context of community building and partnership, because it can create really important avenues for civic participation and inviting stakeholders and encouraging their involvement with your work by strategizing or building innovative ways to do this. So in her TED Talk, Catherine gave examples of how citizens were invited to participate with a citizen engagement program. So citizens were invited to participate in a write-a-thon for these different municipalities that were working on a portion of their website. So these were cities in Honolulu, in I believe it was Texas, and there was a couple of other communities that she mentioned. I can't think of them offhand. Anyway, she gave examples of how citizens were invited into a write-a-thon process to be able to build out portions of the city's website that were Q&As. So imagine yourself being a new person moving to a community and you want to know about public transportation, for example. They got this group of citizens together who created lots of different answers to help people understand different access to resources and community and just some basic questions. So I thought it was a really unique example of this write-a-thon, and it, they showed video of how successful this was, and people really getting excited about having a venue to participate in community in that way. And so she's talking about how the role of technology is important in building a healthy democracy that values collaboration, empowerment, participation, and enterprise or innovation. And she also mentioned that a lot of non-technical work is involved in this work of civic hacking, this innovation within existing systems. And to me, that's synonymous with the kind of work that all of you are probably engaged in, trying to make impact in a positive way for people in your community. So in the spirit of that TED Talk and looking at innovation and unique ways of drawing in public participation, I wonder if you have any innovative ideas that you want to share that you've been involved in implementing, either with the organization you're with now or perhaps in the past as volunteers or students or employees of other organizations. What kind of innovative ways have you seen happening in the world, whether it's technology connected or not, when it comes to engaging stakeholders? All right, it looks like I have a hand raised. Let's see if I can figure out how to look at that. All right, I think somebody in Richland County showed a hand raise. Can you type in the chat box if you have a question? Because I'm not sure how to look at a raised hand without shutting down my whole screen. I'm afraid to do that. Oh, sorry, wrong button. Okay. All right, well, I'll give you guys a few more minutes here. Let's think about any innovative ways that you've seen in your communities, in your experience. Electronic survey formats, okay? So sending out maybe a link to folks to participate in surveys that might be a community needs survey or something like that. Yeah, making it easy to invite people is pretty key these days, I think. Not too many clicks, not too many steps for people to actually have a chance to engage. Any other examples out there? All right, well, hopefully we can all think of, some ways, hopefully through some of this information, it's been a little bit inspiring to think about innovative ways that we can reach out to our stakeholders and invite their participation, their engagement. Because yeah, it's getting harder and harder, I think, sometimes to grab people's attention because there's so much noise coming into us from so many different avenues and vehicles. So it can be really challenging. All right, we have another example showing up, allowing university student volunteers to build curriculum for middle school students that they find important. All right, so that's a great example because it's helping your stakeholders to be able to pursue something that they're interested and motivated around. If you have a volunteer that has a passion for the environment, how can you build on that passion and have it be a way to contribute toward the mission or purpose of your organization? So that's great. Engage, embrace people where they're at, embrace what they bring to you, their talents and their skill sets. I was just in a meeting this morning where they were talking about engaging young volunteers and how we really want to be able to capture people's personal interests in what brings them to the table as a volunteer, find out what motivates and sparks their passion and really be able to build on that. And some organizations are better structured to do that. They have more adaptability than others, and that's okay. But being able to recognize that as a strategy is really important too. So citizen science programs, stream teams, etc. Yeah, getting people involved in hands-on work, that feels really rewarding a lot of times when people can be out there in the field, gathering data, taking notes, doing surveys, definitely helping them to feel like they're contributing and in meaningful ways to the organization is really important. To engage stakeholders initially, that goes back to being clear about roles and expectations. Here's what we expect of you, but there's also expectations on the part of your stakeholders. What do they expect from you in return? So I think those are some good examples to draw out a few more of those points. So I love that. Those are great examples. Thank you. All right, we'll get through the last couple slides and then have a little bit of time for any questions. All right, so hopefully through identifying stakeholders, recognizing their roles and functions, their influence with your organization, thinking about strategies to engage with new stakeholders or expand your scope of stakeholder work, understanding where they're at in terms of the matrix and how you manage those stakeholders. Hopefully through that type of work, and maybe not in that order or in those levels of priorities, but when your stakeholders become advocates for your program, when they are able to champion and talk with other people about who you are, what you do, why it's important, I really believe from my experience that the possibilities for growth and success are really amplified for your organization, for you, for the community itself. So think about how this growth of engagement can really help raise more money in your community. It can reach more people in the community, engage more volunteers, ultimately then achieving greater community impact so that we can work ourselves out of a job and eradicate some of these immense social and environmental problems that we are all charged with with addressing through our community engagement work right now. So that is very big picture and visionary. But that's what drives me in a lot of my work is, being mindful of that future vision and what we're here for and what we're trying to accomplish. So I open up now. We've got about 7 minutes left on the webinar today. So I want to be able to open up to any examples of really effective stakeholder engagement or outcomes that you've seen that you still want to share with the group. This is the time when you can answer, or rather ask any questions that I will try to answer, and any comments that you might have or other pieces that you might want to contribute, other pieces of information that you think would be relevant and helpful at this stage. So any examples of what you've seen that's really been effective and successful with your current organization or past work that you've been involved in? Questions or clarifications that you might have that I can help you with? I'll stop talking and just read the chats as they come through. All right, questions at all if you don't want to share any examples? Any areas that I need to clarify or stuff I didn't cover that you're interested in hearing about? The chat is still very quiet. I'm trying to be patient. It's always hard with as a presenter when there's silence, but this is an interesting format where we don't have the chance to have face-to-face dialogue. All right. Well, unless any questions come up in the next few seconds, I just want to thank you all for your time and your attention this morning. I hope that the information I've shared has been helpful in how you think about your work and how you're positioning yourself in the organization to increase and maximize your effectiveness. All right, so now we do have some chats. Thanks. Thank you for the thank you. Question, how do you get stakeholders that are leaving to recommend others to fill their spot? That's a good question. So it potentially could depend on the stakeholder themselves. So if it's a volunteer, definitely some organizations will do exit interviews with stakeholders, and that's sometimes a good way to get input about the relationship itself, any ideas they have for future growth or improvements of efficiencies or impacts. And that would be a good time to be able to ask, who would they suggest that you do some outreach with? So if you're able to do that either through an in-person exit interview, and as one of our chat contributors said earlier, what I've turned to now with some of the groups I work with is an online survey tool. So when I'm working with audiences that in higher ed, sometimes we're tied to the academic world. And so I work with people on a semester by semester basis. And at the end of the semester, I'll send them a quick survey, an online survey that just asks for their feedback and gives them an opportunity to provide input. But that's something very specific. If you designed that as an exit survey to be able to ask, who would they suggest you reach out to, or what other groups might be in line now that they're familiar with your organization and what you do, who else would they suggest that you do some outreach to? And I suppose it also depends on the grounds on which that stakeholder is leaving the partnership. So if it's something where, it's a tension situation, a conflict situation, you have to probably be more strategic and delicate about the kind of communication you have there. But again, if it were me, I would want to know if there was a problem, why somebody was leaving, and trying to at some point do damage control too, because if you have someone leave the organization that's not happy, either as a stakeholder or other status within the organization, you want to make sure that you're covering your bases and understanding the grounds on which they're leaving, so you can clarify any misperceptions about that too. So maybe not a super direct answer, but part of it is it depends on who the stakeholder is, what their role was in the organization, what their reason for leaving. But I would definitely try to get, if not in person, individual exit interview type feedback. Then I would be able to, encourage you to create some sort of an online survey tool through SurveyMonkey or something very quick and simple like that, where they could answer a few very brief questions and provide input about reaching out to others to fill their spots. Board members, if that's the stakeholder group you're talking about, that can be tough too. But certainly as a board member, I've been a board member on many organizations, and typically board members that are invested and supportive of the organization will want to help you connect to other potential board members and people who would be of like mind with the kind of mission and programs that your organization is involved in. So that social web is super important for lots of stakeholders. And so I think asking those folks directly, how can we work better to expand our social web and our networking and our connections to continue to bring in new people and new stakeholders. I hope that answers your question. It was a long rambling answer based on different ones, different groups. Okay, great. Sounds like it's answered. Any other questions? We've got 1 minute. On the last slide here, it has my contact information. So like Josh said in the beginning, please do feel free to reach out and connect with me about any other questions or comments. If you need more resources or want to run a specific situation by me, I'm happy to troubleshoot and provide input for you. So thanks so much for your time. Thanks for your service. I hope that wherever you are, you're enjoying some spring-like weather, off and on at least. We're still waiting for it, but thanks a lot. And we look forward to having you next week on Tuesday at the next CBI session with Shannon Stober, who will be talking about advisory groups and the important role that they play with your work. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.